The sentinel's teeth were close enough that I could feel its breath change the temperature of my throat, and somewhere outside the ring, a voice that was not allowed to enter it was roaring a word he was not supposed to say in front of the whole assembled pack. Not my title, not even close. Something else. Something with only 3 syllables and no formality in it at all. The kind of word you save for someone you have already decided you cannot lose. I did not look toward the voice. I could not afford to. I kept my eyes exactly where they belonged, on 400 pounds of trained, snarling wolf that someone had very deliberately forgotten to leash, and I told myself the same thing I had told myself the first time I ever hid from him. Do not run. Whatever you do, do not run. 9 weeks before any of that, I was hiding behind a cart of very ordinary cabbages, for reasons that had nothing to do with wolves and everything to do with not wanting to be looked at. My name is Tilda, and I have never in my life wanted to be looked at. Which is an inconvenient thing to want when you are an omega in a king's territory, and the king's territory has opinions about omegas standing still long enough to be counted. I was 21 that spring, market-born and market-raised, 3 stalls down from where my mother had sold vegetables before me, and I had exactly 1 skill worth mentioning, I could tell, from 6 paces, whether a man intended to haggle honestly or waste my morning. It is not a skill anyone writes songs about. It has kept me fed for 9 years regardless. Thorncrest was alpha country, same as every territory in the north, which meant the pack's hierarchy sat over the whole town, like weather nobody voted on. Alphas at the top, ranked warriors under them, betas running the ordinary business of the pack, and omegas. Omegas were a category everyone had opinions about, and nobody quite agreed on. Gentle, biddable, suited to a king's household, if a king ever bothered to look twice. I had spent my whole life making certain no king ever had a reason to. Once every generation or so, when an alpha king's wolf reached full maturity, the pack held a choosing, a procession through every town in the territory, the king himself walking it in his own skin. Because pack law held that a king's wolf always knew his mate before the king's mind caught up to the fact, and the procession was meant to give the wolf its chance among the gathered omegas of age. Every unmarried omega in Thorncrest was required to stand in the market square and be counted when the procession came through. Not chosen. Counted, catalogued, like inventory, in case some future decade required the list. I had been counted 8 times since I came of age. I had never once wanted to be counted a 9th. I had other reasons besides simple stubbornness. 3 winters back, the Crown had raised the market tax twice in a single season to pay for a border skirmish nobody in Thorncrest had asked for, and my mother had gone without a coat that year, so I would not go without boots. I did not hate King Alaric personally. I had never laid eyes on the man, but I had decided, somewhere around that second tax hike, that whatever the Crown wanted from people like me, it was never going to get it for free, and certainly not for the price of standing in a square being counted like a sack of turnips. So on the morning of the choosing, when the horns sounded at the edge of town, I did not go and stand where I was supposed to stand. I ducked behind my own cart, wedged myself between a crate of cabbages and a barrel of turnips, and held my breath. The procession was, I will admit, magnificent. Banners the colour of dried blood, the king's personal guard in formal fur, and at the very centre of it, walking on 4 legs, where a king would ordinarily walk on 2, a wolf the size of a small horse, silver grey, moving with the loose, contained power of something that could dismantle the whole market square, and had simply decided not to. That was pack law too, the older women in the market always said. A king processed through his territory in his own skin, at least once each generation, so his people could see the shape their protection actually took. I held my breath and watched the pause go by. I thought I had gotten away with it. Then the pause stopped. I heard the crowd's murmur change texture, confusion first, then something sharper. I heard a man's voice say something too low to catch, and then, unmistakably, the particular silence of several hundred people holding their breath at once. Something large nosed the crate of cabbages aside like it weighed nothing, put its head directly into the gap where I was hiding, looked at me with eyes the colour of a struck match, and sat down. Just sat. Tail curled around its paws, ears forward, entirely, insufferably pleased with itself, like a very large dog that has found where you hid the good bone. I was still holding a cabbage. I do not know how long I stayed frozen there, crouched in cabbage leaves, staring at 400 pounds of king, before the king himself remembered he had a human shape and used it. The shift happened the way I am told all alpha shifts happen, when the wolf is not fighting for its life, fast, and a little ungraceful, fur retreating like a tide going out, until a man crouched where the wolf had been, someone already draping a cloak over his shoulders before he had fully finished shifting, looking at me with an expression of pure, uncomplicated bewilderment. He was younger than I expected, and better looking than was strictly fair to the rest of us. Raki, someone behind him said, a broad, weathered man I would later know as Gunnar, the king's second, in the particular tone of a man who has just watched his life get more complicated. Get up. You're in a vegetable cart. I am aware Gunnar the king did not get up. He was still looking at me. I have never done this before. You've never sat, Your Grace? Not at someone. I don't sit at people. He said it like it was important I understood this about him specifically, as though his dignity hinged on the distinction. I don't know why I did that. I was still holding the cabbage. You're holding a cabbage, he said, as if this were the strangest detail in a genuinely strange morning, which, to be fair, considering the morning, it might have been. I'm aware, Your Grace. The crowd did the thing crowds do when they do not know whether to be delighted or scandalized. They went very quiet, and then they went very loud, all at once. I heard someone say chosen in the reverent tone reserved for things you have waited your whole life to gossip about. I heard someone else say an omega, a market omega, like the words themselves tasted strange. Gunnar cleared his throat. Your Grace. Formally, you understand. A choosing requires. I know what it requires. The king had not stopped looking at me. Up close he had a scar through one eyebrow and the specific focused stillness of a man doing complicated arithmetic in his head and not liking the answer. What is your name? I considered lying. I have never been good at lying to a direct question, which is a genuine professional handicap in a marketplace. Tilda, he said it like he was testing whether it fit in his mouth. I don't suppose you'd care to explain why you were hiding behind a vegetable cart during your own king's procession. I don't suppose you'd care to explain why your wolf just sat on my foot, Your Grace. Gunnar made a sound that might have been a laugh, disguised, badly, as a cough. The king looked, for the first time since he had shifted back, faintly panicked. No, he admitted. I really wouldn't. Pack law was specific about a great many things, and vague about almost nothing, and it turned out to be entirely specific about this. Once a king's wolf chose in front of witnesses, the choosing could not simply be ignored. Not by him, and not by the Omega in question, not without a formal hearing before the pack elders to determine why. I did not have to accept him. I was told this several times by several increasingly nervous stewards, as if repetition might make it comforting. I only had to appear once, at the keep, to be formally released from the obligation if that was what I wanted. I fully intended it to be what I wanted, and told myself so the entire cart ride to the keep, still holding the cabbage I had somehow never put down, because someone had decided it would look strange for me to arrive at the king's own castle empty-handed after everyone in the square had watched me hold it for a quarter of an hour. The great hall of Thorncrest Keep was full of exactly the kind of people I had spent 9 years successfully avoiding, and every one of them turned to look at me and my cabbage the moment I walked in. Lady Rosamond Ashworth found me before the king did. I would learn later that she had been the pack elder's quiet favourite for the choosing for the better part of 2 years. Raised for exactly this moment since she was a girl, and that watching a market omega walk in holding a vegetable had cost her more composure than she was used to spending in public. "How resourceful," she said, to the cluster of ladies around her rather than to me, in a voice pitched to carry. I hadn't realised the criteria this year included produce. "It's a good cabbage," I said. "You're welcome to it, if you're jealous." Someone near the back laughed before they could help it. Rosamond's smile did not move, which was somehow worse than if it had. I was released from the hearing within the hour, technically free to go home and never think about any of this again, which is precisely what I intended to do, right up until I reached my own stall the next morning and found the market steward waiting for me with a folded notice and an apologetic face. My trading permit had been revoked. Some irregularity in the family record, the notice said, requiring review before it could be reinstated, the kind of bureaucratic phrase that means nothing and everything at once. I marched to the keep the next morning, cabbage-less this time, and found Lady Rosamond in a garden that probably cost more to maintain than my mother had earned in a lifetime. "You revoked my permit." "I sit on a council of 9, she said, not looking up from her needlework. "I hardly control it single-handedly." "You control enough of it. I'd like it back." She looked up then, and for one unguarded moment I saw something under the composure that was not cruelty at all. It was fear, plain and old. The fear of a woman who has spent her whole life being told she was owed a specific future and has just watched a stranger with a cabbage take it in front of witnesses. "I have been groomed for that man's attention since I was 9 years old," she said. "Every lesson, every gown, every carefully arranged introduction, all of it, for a choosing his wolf made in 4 seconds over a vegetable cart. Forgive me if I am not eager to smooth your path to a life I have spent 2 decades earning. I never asked for it. That," she said, "is somehow the most insulting part." I did not get my permit back that day. I did, for the first time, understand exactly what I was standing in the middle of, and that Rosamond and I were both, in our own ways, being asked to pay for a decision neither of us had made. Alaric found me 3 days later at my mother's old house at the edge of the market district, sitting on the front step doing absolutely nothing productive, which I imagine was noteworthy for a man who apparently did nothing but productive things. He had come without gunner, without guards, in a plain coat that did not remotely disguise who he was to anyone who had spent a quarter hour watching him shift out of his own skin in a public square. "I heard about the permit," he said, sitting down on the step without asking. An uninvited familiarity that should have annoyed me more than it did. "I can have it reinstated within the hour. I don't want it reinstated by a king doing me a favour. I want it reinstated because it should never have been taken. Those aren't mutually exclusive. They are to me." He was quiet for a moment, turning that over. He did not reach for my hand, sitting there on the step close enough that our sleeves nearly touched. I noticed the nearly more than I noticed almost anything else that week. "I don't understand what's happening to me," he said finally, which was not at all what I expected him to say. "I have been alpha of this territory for 6 years. I have never once lost control of my own wolf. Not in battle, not in grief, not in anything." And then I processed through my own market square, and he simply decided, without consulting me, sat down in front of a woman holding a cabbage and would not move, and I have not had a full night's sleep since. Because some part of me that I apparently do not control is entirely certain he made the right choice, and the rest of me has no idea why. Maybe he just likes cabbage. That surprised a laugh out of him. Short, real, nothing kingly about it at all. Maybe he does, he said. Or maybe I've been coming to your stall for 2 months under a hood and telling myself it was because the cabbages were genuinely that good, and my wolf simply ran out of patience with the lie before I did. I went very still. I beg your pardon? Something shuttered behind his eyes. Quick, involuntary. A man realizing half a second too late he had said more than he meant to. Nothing, he said. Ignore that. I'm tired, and I'm saying strange things. I did not ignore it. But I let it go, that day, because I did not yet understand what I had just been handed, and because he stood up rather quickly afterward and made his excuses and left, and because, I will admit this reluctantly, some small, undignified part of me was too busy noticing that he had blushed to press him further. I did not know yet what 2 months under a hood meant, or what it would cost either of us once I worked it out. If you want to find out whether a king who cannot lie to himself for much longer stays honest when it actually matters, and whether an Omega who has spent her whole life avoiding notice survives being chosen in front of an entire court that resents her for it, stay with me. There is a good deal more cabbage in this story before it is through, I promise you that much. I did not sleep well that night, turning over every strange, oversized coin the hooded customer had always left on my cart. Every odd question he had asked, every time he had vanished the moment real trouble showed up nearby. Like a man who could not risk being seen. By morning I had worked out the whole of it, and I did not wait for an appointment. Gunnar took one look at my face at the keep door and stepped aside without a word. I found Alaric in the same library-adjacent room. Every self-important man in this story apparently retreats to when he does not want to be found. How long? He did not pretend not to understand. 4 months, he said. I saw you in the square the first time by accident. You told a merchant twice your size exactly why his scale was rigged, and did not apologize for being right. I kept coming back, telling myself increasingly complicated lies about cabbage quality, until there was no lie left large enough to hold it. You let me think this was your wolf's decision. Some accident you had no say in. I told myself that too. It was easier than being the coward who noticed a market Omega for 4 months and said nothing. My wolf did not betray me in that square. Tilda, he just ran out of patience waiting for the rest of me to catch up to something I had already decided. I was angrier than I expected. Not because he had wanted me, I could have forgiven wanting. Easily, because he had let me believe I was chosen by something blind and involuntary. When the truth was smaller and far more frightening, I had been chosen, on purpose, by a man who had watched me for months and never once given me the chance to choose back. You should have told me. Not the wolf. You. I know. I don't like being managed, not by the crown, not by pack law, and not by a king too frightened of his own feelings to say them out loud. Something in me went very still and very clear, the way it does when you finally understand exactly what you are willing to fight for and exactly what you are not willing to forgive. If you want me, I said, you are going to have to want me honestly. From now until whenever this ends. No more hoods. No more wolves doing your talking for you. Agreed, he said, quiet and entirely serious. No trace of the bewildered boy who had sat in a vegetable cart. Honestly then, I would like to court you. Properly, in my own skin, in daylight, without a single lie between us. That's a start. It was not, I will admit, the reconciliation of a woman who had fully forgiven him. It was the beginning of one, which is a different and slower thing, and I have come to think it was the more honest of the two. Gunnar found me 2 days later in the market, where my permit had finally, quietly been reinstated without any king doing me visible favours, and told me, without much preamble, about the part of pack law nobody had bothered to mention yet. An Omega chosen outside the noble houses has to stand the iron circle, he said. Old right. Proves nerve, proves she won't panic and expose the pack to danger the first time something frightens her. A trained sentinel, muzzle broken, trained to stop the charge a hand's width short. It looks terrifying. It is technically quite safe. Technically, the handler controls the leash length, as long as the right person is holding it. I understood the shape of that warning even before I asked who usually held the leash, and I understood it even better when Gunnar told me the answer was. This season, a man whose gambling debts Lady Rosamund's family had recently, and rather generously forgiven. Tell Alaric, I said. Tell him what? That a man who has served the pack honestly for 11 years once accepted a kindness from a noble family, the way half the keep has at one time or another. There's no proof in a forgiven debt, Tilda. There's only a shape I don't like the look of. Gunnar's jaw worked. I'll be watching the yard myself. That's the most I can promise you without accusing a man of something I can't yet show. I did not sleep the night before the trial either. I spent it instead in the still room behind my own stall, sharpening a skill I actually possessed, which was standing my ground in front of something large and unreasonable, and refusing to be the one who blinked first. I had done it for 9 years with merchants. I told myself a wolf could not be so very different. I did not know, that night, that 2 streets away Lady Rosamund was standing in her own garden with the handler, speaking too quietly for the servants to repeat with any confidence, pressing something small and folded into his hand that was not, whatever else it was, an apology. I only learnt of it afterward, in pieces, the way you learn most of the worst things that happen to you, too late to stop them, in time only to understand why. The iron circle stood in the old training yard behind the keep, a ring of iron stakes strung with chain, ancient enough that generations of nervous Omegas had stood exactly where I now stood, in a plain grey dress, watched by every ranked family in the territory. Alaric was not permitted inside the ring. That was also old law. Older than the crown itself, the trial had to prove her nerve alone, unaided, or it proved nothing. He stood just outside the chain, close enough that I could see his jaw working, and did not so much as blink through the entire ceremonial reading of rites, most of which I did not hear because I was watching the handler lead the sentinel in. Gunnar stood 2 paces from him, close enough to the chain that I understood, without being told, that he had chosen that spot on purpose. Lady Rosamund sat with the ranked families, hands folded, composure fixed so carefully in place that I only recognised it, from the garden, as a mask worn over something else entirely. I did not have time to decide what that something else meant. An elder was already reading the old words. Nerve unproven is a danger to the whole pack. The right is mercy dressed as trial. Words I had heard recited over other Omegas my whole life, and never once expected to stand inside myself. It was an enormous wolf, dust brown, scarred along one shoulder, muzzled with a chain lead the handler was meant to snap taut at exactly the right distance. He did not snap it taut. He let it run. The sentinel came at me full speed, and every ceremonial pretense of a controlled charge went out of the moment along with the slack in that chain. The sentinel's teeth were close enough that I could feel its breath change the temperature of my throat, and somewhere outside the ring a voice that was not allowed to enter it was roaring a word he was not supposed to say in front of the whole assembled pack. Tilda. 3 syllables. No formality in it at all. The kind of word you save for someone you have already decided you cannot lose. I did not look toward the voice. I could not afford to. I kept my eyes exactly where they belonged. On 400 pounds of trained, snarling wolf, that someone had very deliberately forgotten to leash, and I told myself the same thing I had told myself the first time I ever hid from him. Do not run. Whatever you do not run. I did not have a lullaby for this one. I did not have anything, except 9 years of standing behind a cart telling large, difficult men exactly what I thought of them without flinching, and I decided, in the half-second I had to decide anything, that a wolf was simply a very large, very difficult customer, and I had never once given one of those the satisfaction of watching me back down. Sit, I said. It was not a plea. It came out flat and certain, the exact tone I used on merchants who tried to shortchange me, and for one suspended moment the entire training yard held its breath along with me. The sentinel skidded to a stop close enough that its shoulder struck my knee, hackles still raised, breath still ragged with the speed of the charge it had not been meant to complete, and sat. My arm was bleeding, a shallow claw graze along the forearm from the last half-second of the charge, nothing that would scar deep, but enough that the front of my sleeve had gone red before anyone reached me. Enough that I felt my knees discover, rather belatedly, that they had opinions about what had just happened. Alaric was over the chain and inside the circle before the rite technically allowed it, breaking a law older than his crown without so much as slowing down, and had both arms around me before the sentinel had finished settling. You're bleeding. I'm aware, Your Grace. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, rough and relieved and furious all at once, and did not let go. The handler did not survive the next quarter hour with his composure intact. Gunnar had him by the collar before the chain had finished rattling on the ground, and it took very little pressure Gunnar seemed to enjoy applying, before he named the family who had forgiven his debts and told him, in terms he was careful to repeat exactly, that a market omega who had never faced a sentinel before would very likely run, and that a wolf permitted to fully close the distance would simply be following its training a fraction too enthusiastically, and that no one could reasonably blame a handler for an accident. Lady Rosamond did not deny it when Alaric found her, still seated among the ranked families, her composure only just beginning to crack at the edges. I never intended real harm, she said, and I believed, then and now, that some small part of that was true. I intended her to run. I intended the whole court to see a market girl panic and prove she did not belong here. And I intended to be standing exactly where I have always stood, waiting when the pack decided you needed someone steadier instead. I did not intend the handler to be quite so generous with the leash. Intent, Alaric said, is not going to matter a great deal to her arm. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. You are stripped of your council seat, effective today. Your family's trade concessions in the Eastern District are revoked pending a full accounting of what else that seat purchased over the years. You will not be exiled. I am not interested in manufacturing a second victim out of a woman who was, in her own way, promised something and then had it taken from her by my wolf's very bad timing. But you will not sit within a council of mine again. Then he turned, in front of the entire training yard, in front of every ranked family who had spent weeks deciding whether I belonged there, and knelt at my feet the way I had once knelt in cabbage leaves hiding from him, which felt, under the circumstances, like the correct kind of justice. I have spent 4 months being a coward about this, he said, loud enough to carry to the back of the yard, and I am finished with it. Tilda of the market district stood in an iron circle alone, with no rank and no house behind her name, and did not run, and I am not interested in a single opinion in this yard about whether she belongs at my side. She has already proven it more thoroughly than any of you ever will. That's not really a question, I pointed out, my arm still stinging, my knees still unreliable. You didn't ask me anything. No, he agreed, and stood, and did not let go of my hand. Will you have me? Honestly, no hoods, no wolves doing my talking. took you long enough. I kissed him first, in front of the entire training yard, in front of Gunnar's undisguised grin, and Rosamund's very disguised relief, and several hundred ranked witnesses who would talk about it for a decade. And it was brief, and it was mine to give, and it settled something in my chest that had been braced for 9 years against exactly this kind of looking. The healer stitched my arm that evening and told me it would scar, thin and pale, and I decided I did not mind. A market omega ought to have at least one mark to show for standing her ground. The weeks after were not simple. 2 of the 9 families on Rosamund's council resigned in solidarity with her and made certain everyone at court knew it was a protest, not an embarrassment. A ranked cousin of hers tried, briefly, to have the whole choosing declared invalid on a technicality about market-born blood that pack law had not enforced in 2 generations, and was quietly and firmly told no by elders who had watched a sentinel nearly take my arm off and had opinions of their own about where that blame belonged. Being chosen in front of witnesses does not make the choosing comfortable for anyone involved. It only makes it true, which I have found matters more, most days, than comfortable ever did. 6 months later, my stall still stands exactly where it always has. Permit intact. Though these days it is watched over by an unreasonable number of guards who insist on browsing and buy considerably more cabbage than any household could possibly need. Alaric visits without a hood now, most weeks, and still overpays, and still asks strange questions, though these days I know exactly why. My mother would have found the whole thing absurd, I think, and then she would have asked the guards to pay full price like everyone else. I sell a King's Own Guard cabbage at market rate, and not a coin less, on principle, and Alaric has learnt better than to argue about it in front of me twice. Gunnar has taken to calling me the cabbage queen in front of visiting dignitaries specifically to watch Alaric's face do something complicated. I have decided to let him keep doing it. A king should have at least one person left who is not afraid of him, and it may as well be his own second. Rosamund, to everyone's surprise, including her own, has become something like a friend. Not warm, not soft, but honest in a way court rarely allows, and the one person at every gathering who will tell me plainly when a gown looks ridiculous. We do not speak of the Iron Circle. We do not need to. I still keep a cabbage on the counter of my stall, the same variety, every week, though I have never told Alaric why. Some nights I catch him looking at it the way he looked at me that first morning, faintly bewildered, entirely certain, a man still catching up to a decision his better half made for him months before he found the courage to admit it. I hid so well that day. I really thought I had gotten away with it. I have never, not once since, been sorry that I had not. I still wonder what would have happened if that handler had been an honest man, or if Rosamund had simply let me run, instead of engineering a wolf with real teeth to prove her point. Do you think Alaric should have told me about the hood sooner, or do you understand why a king spent 4 months too afraid to say it out loud? Tell me your theory in the comments. Comment cabbage if you want to hear the story of the first time Alaric tried to haggle honestly and failed spectacularly. And if you want more nights like this one, a king too oblivious to know his own heart, an omega who never once ran when it counted, and a market stall that somehow ended up at the centre of an entire territory's gossip, stay close. There is more of Thorncrest left to tell. Where are you listening from tonight? I would love to know. The men wore no colours I recognised, which told me everything I needed to know about how much trouble we were in, and one of them already had a gloved hand closing around a small, furious, snapping shape that was trying its very best to bite through leather. I did not think. I threw the only weapon I had, a fistful of ground nettle powder meant for easing swollen joints, useless against steel. Apparently quite effective against a man's unprotected eyes. He screamed. The pup wriggled free and bolted for me instead of away. which was, in hindsight, exactly the wrong direction for either of us to be running. Somewhere behind me, a sound came out of the trees that did not belong to any man I had ever heard, and I understood, in the half-second before everything happened at once, that I was about to find out exactly how much of the king's reputation had been true after all. 3 days before any of that, I found a wolf pup shivering under a fallen log at the edge of Hollowmere Wood, and spent the whole of a very long day trying to discover whose child he was. My name is Orla, and I have gathered herbs at the edge of Hollowmere Wood since I was old enough to tell Nettle from Foxglove, which in a village with one healer and a great many aching backs made me considerably more useful than my station would otherwise suggest. I had no house name worth mentioning, no dowry, no particular prospects beyond the quiet. Useful life of a woman who knew which roots eased a fever and which ones stopped a heart. I liked that life. It asked very little of me and gave, in return, exactly what I put into it. I was 23 the spring I found the pup. Hollowmere sat at the far edge of Alpha Country, close enough to the wilder borders that we saw more wolves passing through than most villages ever did, and far enough from the king's own keep that most of us had never laid eyes on him at all. King Magnus ruled from Ironmore, 3 days' ride north, and what we knew of him we knew from traders and rumour, that he was the strongest alpha in 4 territories, that his temper had ended more than one border dispute before it started, and that no sane person crossed him twice. We knew less about the boy, though what little reached us was strange enough to remember. A son, born the same winter his mother died, raised, the traders said, behind more guards than the treasury itself. No public presentations, no naming day feast the way most alpha heirs got, loud and open to the whole territory. Just a closed household, and a king who was said to have gone considerably harder and colder in the years since his wife's death than he had been before it. I had filed the rumour away the way I filed most gossip that had nothing to do with my own small corner of the world, and thought no more of it, until the morning I found a pup shivering under a log, with no mother anywhere in sight. I found the pup curled beneath a fallen log, no bigger than a barn cat, shivering, one paw tucked awkwardly against his chest in a way that suggested a fall, rather than an injury from teeth. He growled at me for exactly as long as it took him to decide I was not a threat, and then he simply attached himself to my ankle and refused to be parted from it, which settled the matter of what I intended to do with the rest of my day. I spent the morning knocking on every door in Hollowmere that kept livestock near the wood, in case some travelling pack had lost a straggler. I spent the afternoon at the mill, where old Ansel swore he'd seen wolf folk camped near the North Bridge a fortnight back, a lead that came to nothing but 3 wasted hours and a blister. By dusk, I had exhausted every possibility I could think of, and had, somewhere in the course of the day, stopped thinking of the pup as a problem to solve, and started thinking of him as a small, stubborn houseguest who had decided, entirely without consulting me, that my basket was an acceptable place to nap. I was sitting on my own doorstep, resigned to keeping him at least for the night, when the ground began to shake. Not literally, I want to be precise about that, because I have told this story enough times now that people expect thunder. It was the sound of a great many boots moving with a great deal of purpose, and then the sound of my neighbours going very quiet, the particular quiet of people who recognise danger and have decided their best option is stillness. He came out of the tree line like the forest itself had simply rearranged to produce him, tall in the way that made doorways look smaller, dressed in dark, practical fur rather than any crown I would have recognised, and wearing an expression I can only describe as a man holding himself together through the specific violence of his own restraint. The pup went off like a loosed arrow. He hit King Magnus somewhere around the knee, an undignified full-body collision that would have staggered a smaller man, And the king of Ironmoor, the alpha my neighbours, had gone the colour of old linen, simply watching approach, dropped to both knees in the dirt of my dooryard, and gathered the pup up against his chest with both arms, and made a sound I would not have believed a man his size capable of making, something raw and wrecked and entirely unroyal. "Fen," he said into the pup's fur, over and over, like it was the only word he had left. "Fen. Fen." I looked around at my neighbours, every single one of them frozen mid-motion, and understood, finally, why everyone in Hollowmere had gone so quiet. I had spent the whole day looking for a lost dog. I had apparently been minding the Alpha King's son. He did not stand immediately. He stayed there in the dirt for a long moment with his son's face buried against his neck, and when he finally looked up at me, whatever had been raw and wrecked in his face a moment before had already begun folding itself back into something colder, more composed. A king reassembling himself in real time, in front of an audience he had not chosen. You found him. He found me, more accurately. I spent the day trying to find you. You could have sent word to the keep. A rider. Anything. Instead, you kept him for an entire day among strangers, with no notion who he belonged to, no notion what. He stopped himself, visibly, the words costing him something to hold back. I had no way of knowing he belonged to anyone important, Your Grace. He looked like a lost pup. I treated him like one. He is the heir to Ironmoor. He was, this morning, a frightened animal with a hurt paw and no supper. I'm afraid I didn't have time to check his credentials before I fed him. Someone behind him made a sound that might have been a cough, and was very obviously a laugh badly disguised. Magnus did not turn to look, though a muscle in his jaw suggested he very much wanted to. Fen, for his part, showed no interest whatsoever in returning to whatever dignified transition his father had planned. He had both fists knotted in Magnus's collar, and gave every indication of intending to stay there through sheer stubbornness alone, a trait I suspected he had not learned from strangers. "He's not going to let go easily," I offered, since no one else seemed inclined to address the small, immovable problem currently attached to the king's throat. He rarely does, these days. Something moved behind Magnus's eyes, quick and guarded. Garrick, see that the woman is compensated for her trouble, and that Hollowmere understands the debt this pack owes it. I don't want payment. Everyone wants payment. I wanted my afternoon back, mostly, and possibly to know whether that mill story about wolf folk at the North Bridge has any truth to it, because I wasted 3 good hours chasing it. I looked at Fen, who had gone very quiet, watching me with the same unblinking attention he had given me all afternoon. And I suppose I'd like to know he's all right. Properly, not from a rider a week from now. Magnus studied me for a long moment, the way you study something you had not accounted for, and are now recalculating around. "Come to Ironmoor tomorrow," he said, "and see for yourself." Garrick fell into step beside me as the party made ready to leave, close enough that only I could hear him. "This isn't the first time," he said low, "just so you're not caught off guard by how the keep reacts tomorrow. It's the 4th time this season the boys slipped his watchers. Each time worse than the last." He glanced back at Magnus, still crouched in my dooryard, still not quite ready to stand with his son wrapped around him. Something's not right about how easily he keeps managing it. I'd be careful, if I were you, about how deep you let yourself get pulled into this. I did not understand, that evening, what he meant by careful. I would understand it considerably better within the week. I went to Ironmoor the next morning, mostly out of stubbornness, and partly because I could not stop thinking about the particular quality of relief on a king's face when his son had barreled into his knees. The keep was exactly as imposing as I expected, and considerably less comfortable, all cold stone and colder formality, and Fen found me before anyone official could. barreling down a corridor at a speed no nursemaid seemed capable of matching and attaching himself to my leg with the same enthusiasm as the day before. "He's been asking for you since dawn," said a tired-looking nurse, sounding equal parts grateful and faintly scandalized. "Refused breakfast until someone promised him you'd come." Magnus found us in the garden an hour later, Fen asleep in my lap, the way he had apparently decided was now customary, and stood in the doorway for a long moment before he spoke. In a posture I was beginning to recognize as his particular way of working up courage. "Garrick tells me you asked about the wolf folk at the North Bridge," he said. "There was no camp. I had it checked myself, this morning, before you arrived. Then who started the rumour?" "I don't know yet. I intend to find out." He crossed the garden and sat, carefully, a measured distance away, close enough to see his son's face, far enough that I understood the distance was deliberate. "Fen has slipped his watchers 4 times this season, always toward the village, always in daylight, when he's least likely to actually be lost for long. I used to think it was simple mischief. And now? Now I think my son has been searching for something none of us have managed to give him, and I am trying very hard not to examine too closely what that says about the household I've built for him." His jaw tightened. 3 years ago, someone tried to take him from that same garden. My own cousin's man, we later learned, though we never proved Varick's hand in it directly enough to act on. Since then, I have kept him so closely watched, he has apparently decided the watching itself is the thing worth escaping. I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing, and let the garden's quiet do the work. Silence usually does better than words. Magnus did not reach for me. I did not reach for him. We sat there instead, a measured distance apart, with his sleeping son between us like a small, warm, oblivious chaperone, and I found I did not mind the distance nearly as much as I might have expected to. "You should be careful," he said, eventually, coming here. "Being seen with him. If Varick is watching for weakness, a village herbalist with no house behind her name is exactly the kind of weakness he'd know how to use." "I appreciate the warning, Your Grace. I don't think I'm going to take it." Something that was almost a smile moved across his face, there and gone. "No," he said. "I didn't think you would. I did not know, that afternoon, how right Garrick's warning was going to turn out to be, or how much a boy's habit of running toward the one place that felt safe to him was about to cost all 3 of us. If you want to find out whether a king's fear of losing his son again is stronger than the good, stubborn thing that's already starting to grow in that garden, stay with me. What happens next in Hollowmere is not something any of us saw coming, myself included. I went back to Ironmoor 3 more times that week, each visit a little less formal than the last, each one ending with Fen negotiating, with the shameless confidence of a 6-year-old who has never once been told no by anyone he actually respects. For exactly 1 more story before I was allowed to leave, Magnus started walking me to the gate himself, a task I suspected belonged to someone considerably lower in the household hierarchy, and each time he found some new, thin excuse to make the walk last a few minutes longer than it needed to. "You could simply say you enjoy the company," I told him, on the 4th such walk, instead of inventing a fresh reason to inspect the gate hinges every time I leave. The hinges genuinely do need attention. Every single time. Ironmoor is an old keep. Things wear down. He did not quite meet my eyes when he said it, which told me considerably more than the words did. I had started, by then, to notice the particular quality of quiet that settled over the household whenever I arrived. Not suspicion, exactly, but a kind of careful watching, as though everyone from the stable boys to the eldest council members were waiting to see whether I intended to stay long enough to matter. I told myself I did not care what any of them thought. I mostly believed it. Garrick found me a week later, back in Hollowmere, grim in a way that told me before he said a word that the careful I had been warned about had run out. "We found out how he keeps slipping the watch," Garrick said. "Someone's been altering the rotation logs. Small changes. A name moved an hour early. A gate left unmanned for 10 minutes that shouldn't be. Someone with access to the schedules is making certain there's always a gap exactly when Fen decides to run. Varric, we can't prove it. Not yet. But the pattern only started after your first visit. Which means whoever's doing this either wants Fen caught somewhere he shouldn't be, or wants him caught with someone it would be politically useful to blame." Garrick's jaw worked. "I think it's you they're setting up to take the fall for this, one way or another. Either they take him while he's with you, and it looks like negligence on Ironmore's part they can exploit, or they take him and make certain it looks like you helped." Something in me went very still and very clear. The particular stillness of understanding exactly what I was standing in the middle of, and exactly what I intended to do about it regardless. "Then we stop waiting for him to make the next move," I said. "Tell Magnus I'm not going anywhere. If Fen keeps running toward Hollowmere, I'd rather be ready for what's waiting there than pretend staying away keeps anyone safe." Varric found me at the market 3 days later. Pleasant in the particular way powerful men are pleasant right before they stop being so. "I understand you've become something of a fixture at Ironmore," he said. "Admirable. A village girl catching a king's eye. Foolish, given how these things tend to end for women without a house behind them. I'd hate to see you caught in the middle of a family matter that has nothing to do with you." "I wasn't aware minding a frightened child counted as a family matter, my lord. Everything involving the succession is a family matter." Something moved behind his eyes, brief and cold. "I'd think carefully about how much time you spend near that boy. Ironmore has a way of losing patience with outsiders who overstay a king's momentary gratitude." I told him I understood. I did not tell him that I had already decided, days before, that I intended to keep doing exactly what I had been doing, regardless of what any lord thought was wise. I told Garrick about the conversation that same evening, expecting him to be alarmed. He was not. "Good," he said. "Let him think you're rattled. A man who believes he's already won stops being careful, and Varric has not been careful in weeks. He simply hasn't been caught at it yet." He studied me for a moment. "I've doubled the watch on the north gate without telling him. If he's going to make his move using Fen's habit against him, I'd rather know when it's coming than hope we're lucky. And if you're wrong about the north gate, then I'm wrong, and we adjust." He did not look particularly comforted by his own answer, which did not comfort me either. Fen slipped his watches again 8 days later, on a warm afternoon that should have been perfectly ordinary, and ran, as always, straight for Hollowmere. Except this time, when I found him at the edge of the wood exactly where I always seemed to find him. We were not alone. The men wore no colours I recognised, which told me everything I needed to know about how much trouble we were in, and one of them already had a gloved hand closing around a small, furious snapping shape that was trying its very best to bite through leather. I did not think. I threw the only weapon I had, a fistful of ground nettle powder meant for easing swollen joints, useless against steel. Apparently quite effective against a man's unprotected eyes. He screamed. The pup wriggled free and bolted for me instead of away, which was, in hindsight, exactly the wrong direction for either of us to be running. Somewhere behind me, a sound came out of the trees that did not belong to any man I had ever heard, and I understood, in the half-second before everything happened at once, that I was about to find out exactly how much of the king's reputation had been true after all. Magnus came out of that tree line already shifted, and I understood, watching him move, precisely why no sane person crossed him twice. What followed was fast, and brutal, and mercifully brief, and I spent most of it with Fen's face buried in my shoulder, and my own body curled around his, as small as I could make it. listening to sounds I have no wish to describe in detail and would not know how to if I tried. Garrick's men reached the clearing perhaps a minute behind their king, close enough behind that I understood. Later, they must have already been converging on the north gate before the attack even began. Garrick's doubled watch, the one he had not told Varick's people about, doing exactly the job it was meant to do. I heard shouting, and the particular scramble of men realizing an ambush had become a trap of their own. And through all of it, I kept my eyes shut and my arms around Fen and did not look up until the noise had changed shape entirely, from violence into something more like cleanup. When it was over, 3 men were restrained in Garrick's custody and 1 had run, and Magnus stood in the clearing breathing hard, fully shifted back, blood on his hands that was not his own, looking at me and his son with an expression that had nothing composed left in it at all. The man who ran did not get far. Garrick's people caught him before nightfall, and what he told them, once it became clear loyalty to Varick, was not worth the price he was being asked to pay for it. Was more than enough. Lord Varick had been altering the watch rotations for 2 months, waiting for an opportunity clean enough to use, and had settled, finally, on making it look as though the boy had been taken while in the unsupervised care of a village woman with no standing to defend herself against the accusation. Magnus confronted him in the great hall the next morning, in front of the full household, and I have never in my life seen a man's composure disassemble so completely so fast. "You used my son as bait," Magnus said, "to frame the one person who has done nothing this year but make him feel safe. I have spent 3 years watching you circle this succession like it was owed to you. It was never owed to you, and after today, it is no longer available to you at all." Varick tried, briefly, to argue that no formal proof tied him directly to the men who had ambushed us, that the captured raiders had implicated only intermediaries, that a king acting on suspicion alone set a dangerous precedent for the whole council. It might even have worked, on another day, with a less furious king and a less exhausted room. It did not work on this one. Garrick laid the altered rotation logs on the council table himself, page after page in a hand 3 separate scribes confirmed as Varick's own stewards, and the argument collapsed under the weight of paper rather than passion, which I have since decided is usually the more effective way for these things to end. Fen, once the healer had checked him over and declared him more furious than hurt, would not be separated from me for the rest of that day, which meant I stayed at Ironmore considerably longer than I had planned, and meant that half the household had ample opportunity to watch their king fail spectacularly at pretending he did not also want me to stay. He found me that evening in the same garden, Fen finally, genuinely asleep for once, and knelt in front of me the way he had knelt in my own dooryard 3 weeks before, dirt and all. I have spent 3 years building a household so careful, so guarded, that my own son had to run toward danger to find one honest afternoon, he said. And then a woman with nettle powder and no house behind her name did more to protect him in one moment than every wall I've built in 3 years. I am done being careful in the ways that cost the people I love the most. Stay, not for Fen's sake, though he will be unbearable if you don't. For mine, that's not really a question, Your Grace. No, he agreed. I find I've gotten considerably better at statements than questions, this year. I kissed him first, there in the garden, with his son asleep between us and the whole absurd, terrifying, wonderful day finally catching up with both of us at once. And it was brief, and warm, and settled something in me that had been braced since the moment a wolf pup decided my ankle looked like a good place to stay. The fallout was thorough. Varick was stripped of every title and holding he had ever claimed and exiled beyond Ironmore's borders within the week, and the household spent a long season afterward, tightening every gap he had spent 2 months quietly widening. Garrick was given full authority over the watch rotations going forward. A promotion, he has told me, more than once. He would have traded happily to have never needed. 6 months later, Fen has stopped running toward Hollowmere, mostly because he no longer has to. I live at Ironmore now, in rooms close enough to the nursery that he can reach me without slipping a single watcher, and the household has, with visible reluctance on the part of several old families, gotten used to the sight of their king eating breakfast with a village herbalist and an increasingly opinionated 6-year-old. Fen calls me by a name he invented himself and has refused to explain the origin of, and Magnus tells me, privately, that it sounds suspiciously like the word Fen used to say for his mother before she died birthing him. Though neither of us has ever asked the boy directly, because some things are better left to arrive in their own time. Hollowmere has not entirely gotten used to the change either, though for gentler reasons than Ironmore's. Old Ansel still tells anyone who will listen that he was the one who first mentioned wolffolk at the North Bridge, and takes an entirely undeserved amount of credit for what came of that rumour, which I have decided not to correct him about, because he is old and it makes him happy, and the truth would only give him something new to grumble about instead. Garrick visits Hollowmere twice a season now, ostensibly on King's business, actually to check the perimeter of my mother's old cottage with the same thoroughness he once reserved for Ironmore's own walls. I have told him repeatedly that he does not need to. He has told me, just as repeatedly, that he intends to keep doing it anyway, and I have stopped arguing, because I understand, watching him work, that some men show their loyalty in exactly this way, not with words, but with a fence checked twice, that nobody asked them to check even once. Fen's naming day, the one his mother never got to see finished, was held properly for the first time this spring, open to the whole territory, loud and bright, and considerably less guarded than any household gathering Ironmore had managed in years. He wore the carved wolf pendant Magnus had commissioned for the occasion, and spent most of the ceremony trying to give it to me instead. Apparently under the impression that I would enjoy it more, which I suppose, in his own small way, was Fen's version of choosing me publicly too. The nettle powder recipe has become something of a joke around Ironmore's kitchen since, half the household convinced I keep a jar of it on my person at all times for exactly this purpose. I have not corrected that impression either. It is, on the whole, a useful thing for a king's household to believe about the woman raising his son. I went looking for a lost pup, and found instead exactly where I was supposed to be all along. I have never once regretted the day I spent searching. I still wonder what would have happened if Varrick's man had gotten a better grip before the nettle powder hit, or if Magnus had been 30 seconds slower out of that tree line. I do not like where that thought ends, so I do not finish it. But I wonder about you. Did you suspect Varrick before Garrick named him? Or did the reveal catch you as off guard as it caught me? Tell me your theory in the comments. Comment the nettle if you want to hear about the first time Fen tried to teach the entire Ironmore kitchen staff how to properly chase a chicken. And if you want more nights like this one, a king whose reputation turned out to be armour over something considerably softer. A boy who never stopped running toward the one place that felt safe. And a herbalist who never once regretted getting involved. Stay close. There is more of Ironmore left to tell. Where are you listening from tonight? I would love to know.